There comes a moment in every life when the noise grows too loud. The phone buzzes, the mind races. Days blur together and you start to wonder if you're living or merely existing. That's where I found myself, surrounded by everything yet feeling empty inside. I wasn't broken, I was distracted. Every morning I woke up to 1,000 invisible strings pulling me in directions I didn't choose. Expectations, habits, mindless scrolling, the constant chase for validation. And somewhere in that endless motion, I lost the quiet space where purpose is born. One night I sat in darkness and asked a question I had been avoiding. What if the life I'm living isn't mine? That question didn't whisper. It struck like thunder, because I already knew the answer. The Stoics once said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." I realized my suffering was self-inflicted, built from routine comfort, from saying tomorrow too often, from letting the day decide who I was instead of deciding for myself. So I made a vow, 1 week, just 7 days, to test what would happen if I stopped living on autopilot and started living with intention. Not a challenge, not a punishment, an experiment in awareness. The next morning felt different, not because the sun rose differently, but because I finally noticed it. It wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about removing everything false. I wasn't chasing transformation. I was chasing truth. I wrote down 5 habits, not copied from a book, not borrowed from a guru, but chosen because they felt honest. Each one was small enough to begin, powerful enough to matter. Each one was a reminder that philosophy isn't theory, it's practice. I didn't expect miracles, I expected resistance, because change is not about doing more, it's about doing differently. And the first battle is always internal. The Stoics believe the world is neither cruel nor kind, it simply is. It's our perception that turns experience into suffering or strength. So if my life felt chaotic, it wasn't because life was cruel. It was because I had stopped being the master of my perception. The realization was simple but unsettling. If you don't choose your habits choose you. And they had been choosing for a long time. I thought of every morning spent in bed scrolling through meaningless noise. Every night spent overthinking what couldn't be controlled. Every moment I called relaxation, that was actually avoidance. The mind becomes what it repeats. Mine had become chaos. But the beauty of realization is that it demands action. Awareness without discipline is self-deception. So I decided to treat my life as a philosopher would treat an idea. To test it, question it, reshape it through deliberate practice. I didn't want to add complexity. I wanted to return to simplicity. Because wisdom is often subtraction, removing what no longer serves you until only clarity remains. In that silence, something within me whispered, "Start small, but start completely." I knew that the size of change doesn't matter. The sincerity does. A single intentional week could become the foundation for an intentional life. That's how the journey began, not with a plan, but with awareness. The awareness that the person I had become was not inevitable. It was a pattern I could rewrite. When the Stoics spoke of virtue, they weren't talking about moral superiority. They meant excellence of character, the inner architecture of a stable mind. And stability begins in the smallest moments, when you decide to rise instead of sleep in, to listen instead of react, to act instead of complain. So I stood up that night and promised myself, for 7 days I would live as if each choice mattered, because it does. I would study myself not through judgment, but through observation. Every habit would become a mirror. This wasn't self-help, it was self-study, and the subject was life itself. The next morning, the alarm rang before dawn. My first instinct was to silence it. My second was to remember the vow. That's the space where transformation begins. The tiny pause between impulse and action. In that pause, I chose awareness over comfort. As I watched the world still asleep, I felt something unusual. Control. Not over others, not over the future, but over myself. That was the first taste of freedom Stoics spoke of, the freedom of self-command. I realized that for most of my life, I had mistaken convenience for peace. But peace doesn't come from what's easy. It comes from what's right. And what's right is rarely comfortable at first. That morning, while the sky turned from black to gold, I understood the first truth of change. Nothing changes until you do. The world will not slow down for you. No one will come to fix your mind. No moment will suddenly feel ready. You either start now or continue waiting for a perfect time that never comes. So I began. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly. And that honesty was more powerful than any motivation video, any plan, any promise. It was the quiet certainty that I was finally living deliberately. Every day since has been a dialogue between two selves, the one that seeks comfort and the one that seeks meaning. The Stoics call this prohairesis, the guiding principle within you that decides how you respond to life. If that inner principle is strong, the outer world loses power over you. That's what this week became. Not a list of tasks, but a training of perception. To see life not as chaos to control, but as experience to master. To replace reactivity with reason, and through that, to rediscover stillness. This was the awakening. The quiet revolution inside the mind. The point where excuses end and awareness begins. The moment you stop being a passenger and take the wheel of your own existence. 7 days, 5 habits, 1 decision. That's all it took to begin again. When you wake before the world, you meet a version of yourself that few ever see. No notifications, no voices, just breath and heartbeat. For years I had slept through that silence, convinced that rest was the same as renewal. It isn't. Rest repairs the body. Silence repairs the soul. The first morning of this experiment, the alarm rang while darkness still wrapped the sky. My hand reached for the phone by habit the way it always did. But habit is only memory pretending to be choice. I left it untouched and sat up instead. For a moment I stared into the quiet room, unsure what to do with so much stillness. And then it happened. I heard the soft hum of the city breathing beneath the horizon. It was like meeting life in its raw form, untouched by demand. The Stoics taught that dawn belongs to discipline. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "At dawn, when you rise unwillingly, remember you are rising to perform the work of a human being." I repeated those words aloud, not as motivation, but as a reminder that purpose begins when resistance ends. In that dim light, I felt 2 forces pulling me apart. One craving warmth, the other craving growth. The first whispered 5 more minutes. The second whispered freedom. And that's the truth about early mornings. They aren't a test of time, they're a test of will. When the world still sleeps, the mind is untouched by comparison. There are no opinions to absorb, no noise to filter, no masks to wear. You meet yourself unedited. You hear thoughts before they are shaped by influence. That honesty can be uncomfortable, but it's where strength begins. I walked to the window and watched the night thin into blue. Every second the sky shifted shades, quiet but relentless. That's how change happens too. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the world looks different and you can't remember when it started. The first lesson of waking early isn't about productivity, it's about perspective. You realize that time was never the enemy, a distraction was. We often say we don't have time, but time has always been there, waiting in the dawn for those willing to claim it. In the first light, you can hear the subtle rhythm of existence. Birds before traffic, wind before voices. It's life, unedited, raw, simple. And within that simplicity, something shifts. Anxiety loses its edge, ambition softens into intention. You begin to understand what the Stoics meant by living in accordance with nature. It doesn't mean living in forests. It means aligning your inner rhythm with the rhythm of the world. Each morning became a quiet ritual. I would rise, drink water, breathe, and watch the sun climb. No rush, no list, just awareness. Sometimes I would think, sometimes I would not. That choice itself felt like power, to act or to simply be. Soon I noticed a subtle transformation. The day no longer controlled me. I controlled its beginning. And that single decision rippled outward. When you start the day in control, you end the day with peace. People often chase motivation, but motivation is unreliable. The Stoics preferred discipline, because discipline survives when feelings fade. Waking early every day wasn't easy. It was a quiet rebellion against comfort. But each morning I chose it. The rebellion grew stronger and the excuses weaker. There's something sacred about being awake when the world sleeps. It feels like borrowing hours from eternity. You realize how much of life you've been trading for trivial comfort. 5 more minutes in bed had cost me years of potential. The dawn became my teacher. It taught patience, because beauty takes time to unfold. It taught gratitude, because light returns even after the darkest night. And it taught humility, Because no matter how much you plan, the sun rises on its own schedule. I began to notice details I had ignored for years. The way the air smelled before sunrise, the texture of silence, the rhythm of my own heartbeat. When you slow down enough to notice life, life begins to notice you back. One morning as I sat with a cup of water in hand, I asked myself, why does this matter so much? The answer was simple, because it reminded me that I could choose. Every time you wake early, you are telling the universe, I will lead, not follow. The choice bleeds into everything else. Your focus, your relationships, your energy. Soon, the mornings stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like home. The alarm no longer dragged me from sleep. It invited me into stillness. That's when I understood the essence of Stoic practice. Repetition without resentment. To do what is right, not because it feels good, but because it shapes who you become. Some days the mind resisted. It told me I deserved rest, that one missed morning wouldn't matter. But the Stoics would call that voice the enemy within, the part of us that fears our own potential. I learned to answer it with action, not argument, because silence breaks its power faster than logic ever will. Weeks later, I realized that the habit had changed something deeper than my schedule. It had changed my relationship with time. I no longer felt behind. When the rest of the world began rushing, I had already built a fortress of calm within me. That stillness became my advantage. There is a profound serenity in beginning the day before the world interrupts. It's not about doing more. It's about doing first. Being proactive rather than reactive. When you own your morning, you stop negotiating with life. You stop asking the day for permission to be peaceful. So if you want to transform your life, start by meeting the morning halfway. You don't need perfection, you need presence. The first light doesn't care whether you are ready. It only asks that you show up. And when you do, it rewards you with something rare. Clarity. The kind that cannot be taught, only experienced. The kind that whispers, you are capable of more than yesterday. The Stoics called it eudaimonia, the flourishing of the soul through virtuous action. It doesn't happen in grand victories. It happens in quiet choices like this one, choosing dawn over distraction. So tomorrow when the alarm rings and the world still sleeps, remember this. The first battle of the day decides all the others. Win it with intention. Rise with purpose. Meet the morning before the world does. The body is the vessel of the mind. And for years I treated mine like an afterthought. I fed it when convenient, rested it when forced, and ignored its quiet requests for care. But the Stoics taught that to master the mind, one must first command the body. So on the second day of my experiment, I began to move, not with the goal of perfection, but with the intention of presence. It wasn't about building muscles, it was about building momentum. The world teaches us to associate movement with vanity, to run for aesthetics, to lift for validation. But discipline has nothing to do with appearance. It is the art of keeping promises to yourself, even when no one is watching. That morning, as I stepped outside, the air bit cold against my skin. Each breath reminded me of how alive discomfort could feel. I started walking, slowly, deliberately. My mind protested, whispering the usual excuses. You're tired, you've earned rest, it's too early for this. But I kept walking, and with each step the noise faded. Movement became meditation. With every rhythm of my foot against the earth, I felt myself returning to something ancient, a primal dialogue between body and spirit. The Stoics would have understood this. They believed strength wasn't about dominance, but harmony. To be strong was to be balanced, to endure without complaint, to act without excess. As my heart rate climbed, my thoughts began to slow. That's the paradox of motion. The faster the body moves, the stiller the mind becomes. You stop analyzing, stop planning, stop rehearsing every possible version of life. You just are. And in that simplicity, truth reveals itself. I remembered a line from Epictetus. No great thing is created suddenly. Strength, both physical and spiritual, is carved from repetition. The quiet decision to persist long after enthusiasm fades. Each morning I returned to that practice. Some days it was a run. Other days it was stretching in silence, or a few push-ups on the floor. The form didn't matter, the consistency did. Because discipline isn't built in intensity, it's built in continuity. Within a few days, I noticed a subtle shift. My posture changed, my energy felt cleaner. The body, once sluggish, started to feel like an ally instead of a burden. When I moved, my thoughts moved with me. Forward, not in circles. The Stoics spoke often about control, not the illusion of controlling the world, but the mastery of one's reactions to it. Movement became a living metaphor for that control. When the body resisted, I learned patience. When fatigue whispered, I practiced resilience. When pain spoke, I listened without judgment. Each drop of sweat became a small confession, proof that growth demands effort, and effort demands respect. And slowly I began to respect myself again. Strange how physical action can repair emotional fractures. Every time I moved, I reclaimed a piece of myself I'd abandoned to laziness, doubt, or fear. The act of showing up, not for results but for self-respect, became sacred. In a world addicted to shortcuts, discipline is a quiet rebellion. People search for hacks to bypass struggle, but the Stoics would say, struggle is the hack. Sharpens what comfort dulls. It humbles what pride distorts. It reveals what distraction hides. After the first week, I began to crave the discomfort. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was proof of presence. Each ache, each breath, each repetition became a reminder that I was alive and capable of more than my excuses allowed. There's a moment in every workout where the mind tells you to stop. That's where most people quit. But that's also where transformation begins. Not when it's easy, but when it's unbearable and you keep going anyway. That single second of persistence trains not just muscle, but will. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Physical challenge dismantles that illusion. When you push your body, you realize most suffering is self-created, built from fear, hesitation, or overthinking. In motion, those illusions burn away. Daily movement taught me more about life than any lecture ever could. Taught me that pain isn't the enemy, indifference is. That consistency is more powerful than inspiration. That you don't need to be the fastest or strongest. You just need to keep showing up. By the fourth day, something miraculous happened. I no longer needed to force movement. I desired it, because I associated it with clarity, energy, and alignment. That's how discipline transforms into identity. What begins as effort becomes nature. One morning, I looked at my reflection and realized that my posture had changed. Not just physically, but spiritually. I stood straighter, breathed deeper, spoke slower. The body had learned to reflect the steadiness of the mind. Movement became a metaphor for living, forward, grounded, unwavering. It wasn't about running from something. It was about running toward myself. And every drop of sweat was a small reminder that freedom isn't given. It's earned, step by step. The Stoics would say that our bodies are instruments, not idols. To care for them is to honor the mind that dwells within. And when both work in harmony, life becomes less chaotic, more deliberate. So now, when I move each morning, I don't call it exercise. I call it a ritual, a meeting between will and reality. It's where I remind myself that strength isn't in lifting heavy things. It's in lifting yourself when you fall. Each sunrise is an invitation. Move, breathe, live deliberately, because stillness of the mind begins with motion of the body. So move, not for perfection, but for presence. Not to prove something, but to remember something. Remember that you are alive, capable, and in control of your own energy. And when your body learns discipline, your mind follows. That is the second habit, the discipline of motion, the art of showing up for yourself, the quiet power of choosing movement over stagnation every single day. Most people live surrounded by noise, external, digital, emotional. Yet the loudest noise comes from within. The endless stream of thoughts, regrets, and fears that echo quietly inside the mind. We scroll to silence it. We talk to avoid it. We distract ourselves so we don't have to listen. But the Stoics believed in a sacred practice, the art of self-examination. To sit alone with one's thoughts and ask, who am I becoming through the choices I make each day? That question became the center of my third habit, journaling. At first it felt strange, to sit with an empty page, pen in hand, and stare at your own reflection in ink form. But the more I wrote, the more I realized, journaling isn't about writing beautifully. It's about writing honestly. Each morning, before the noise of the world could reach me, I opened my notebook and emptied my mind onto paper. Not for others to read, not for productivity, but for clarity. Because unexpressed thoughts become emotional clutter, and cluttered minds cannot create peace. The first entry was simple. A single line. What did I do yesterday that made me proud? What did I do that I regret? The simplicity disarmed me. It forced me to confront truths I usually buried under routine. One by one, the words became mirrors. They reflected not who I pretended to be, but who I really was. Impatient, distracted, anxious, hopeful, human. And in that reflection, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Awareness. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius kept a journal too. He called it Meditations, but it wasn't written for the world. It was written for himself, a private dialogue with his own soul. He reminded himself daily of the same truths we still struggle with. That anger is weakness, that gratitude is strength. That control begins within. When I realized that even an emperor wrote reminders to stay humble, I understood journaling wasn't self-indulgence. It was self-discipline, the discipline to meet yourself, raw, unfiltered, imperfect, and still choose to improve. The page doesn't judge. It doesn't interrupt or compare. It simply listens. And sometimes that's all the mind needs. A listener that doesn't speak back. After a few days, I noticed something remarkable. Writing turned my thoughts into objects. Once they were on paper, they lost their power over me. Fears that felt enormous in my head looked small in ink. Problems that felt unsolvable began to unfold naturally once given shape. The Stoics taught that perception shapes suffering. When you write, you shift perception. You turn chaos into language and language into understanding. You begin to see that life isn't happening to you. It's happening for your growth. Some mornings I wrote about gratitude, small things I had overlooked. The warmth of sunlight on my face, a deep breath of cold air, the quiet loyalty of a friend. Gratitude grounded me, and I learned that no day is truly bad when you can find one thing to be thankful for. Other days I wrote about my flaws, the times I reacted instead of responded, the moments I avoided discomfort. But instead of shame, I found compassion, because self-awareness isn't self-criticism, it's self-responsibility. Each page became a classroom, each sentence a lesson, not from others, from myself. I began to understand why the Stoics valued reflection as highly as action. Without reflection, action becomes repetition. Without awareness, growth becomes illusion. We think wisdom is found in books or teachers, but sometimes wisdom is found in our own handwriting. Because writing teaches you to see, and seeing yourself clearly is the beginning of freedom. Over time, journaling turned from a habit into a ritual, a sacred appointment with my inner world. It became the pause between reaction and understanding, the bridge between confusion and clarity. One morning I wrote, "Today I will control only what I can, my thoughts, my actions, my attitude." That simple intention shaped my entire day. It made me realize that journaling isn't just reflection, it's preparation. It sets your mind before the world can unsettle it. Seneca once said, "Every night before going to sleep, we must ask ourselves, what ailment of yours have you cured today? What vice have you resisted? In what respect are you better?" That's what journaling does. It turns your life into a living philosophy. You stop drifting through days and start documenting them. Not for vanity, but for accountability. And here's the hidden truth. Writing doesn't just reveal who you are, it creates who you become. Each entry is a declaration of values, a rehearsal for better decisions. When you write the kind of person you wish to be, you start living in alignment with those words. By the end of the week, I looked back through my pages. They were imperfect, messy, human, but they were real. They told the story of someone learning to listen, someone learning to slow down, someone learning to think before reacting. And in that realization, I found peace. Not because I had solved everything, but because I had stopped running from myself. The world today offers endless ways to escape, but very few ways to return. Journaling is that return. It is the act of coming home to your own mind. Every time I write, I build a bridge between who I am and who I want to be. I see my fears, my doubts, my hopes all laid bare, and in seeing them, I reclaim control. This is why I still journal every morning, not because life is perfect, but because it never will be. And that's exactly why reflection is necessary. When you put pen to paper, you remind yourself that life isn't meant to be rushed. It's meant to be understood. And understanding begins when you start listening, not to the world, but to the quiet voice within. That's the third habit, the discipline of reflection, the art of seeing yourself clearly, the courage to be both the writer and the reader of your own life.